Hey guys, this is Tech Howdy. I welcome you to another video tutorial where we are building this CMS application with Angular 10 and ASP.NET Core 3. In the last video tutorial, we created the login view, and in this video tutorial, we will be implementing the authentication and authorization in our application. Going back to the application, here at the moment when we try to access the home controller of the admin view, we can access it without any problems. That's because this view is not protected yet. If you look at the authentication process in this application, what we need to do in step 1 is first try to protect the view and return an unauthorized response to anyone who's trying to access a protected view. So let's go ahead and try to make this view protected so that it cannot be accessed from the browser without authenticating the user. So if I go to the admin URL, I shouldn't be able to access this page unless I have a authentication token or unless I have logged in. So let's implement the protection feature in the application. To restrict access to unauthorized users on the home controller, we need to place a authorized attribute at the home controller level. Keep in mind that the authorized attribute can also be placed at the functional level or the action level. So placing the authorized attribute at the action level will mean that only this action will be protected from any unauthorized access. So we want to protect all the actions under home controller from unauthorized access. Therefore, we place the authorized attribute at the controller level. The next thing that we need to do is import the required class, which is Microsoft.AspNetCore.Authorization in this controller, so that we can reference the required methods and classes for authorization. Now, the next thing that we need to do is go to the startup class and tell the application that we are going to use authorization in this project. So let's configure authorization. And to configure authorization, all we need to do is call the app.useAuthorization method in the configure method of the startup class. Also, we need to make sure that when we call the app.useAuthorization method, we call it after the routing. So we need to first make sure that the routing is enabled and then the authorization method is called. If we try to place this authorization call before the routing, we will get an error or an information from Microsoft or from the Visual Studio editor saying that we need to place it after routing. It's kind of telling you that this is going to give you an error, so you need to place it after the routing. So the routes need to be enabled so that the client or the user can call those routes, and then the authorization should be implemented. So if I go back to the startup class, now I should not get any errors. Now if I save this, I rebuild this application or rerun this application, and let's try to access the home page of the admin panel. So the application is loaded. Let's go to the admin URL and try to access the admin panel. Now, as you see, when I try to access the admin panel, I'm being redirected back to the home page of our user application, which is the Angular app. That's because now the admin panel or the admin home controller is protected. So unauthorized access would be prevented to the home controller. But that also means that our admin cannot access it. So we need to make sure that the admin can access the home controller, but nobody else should be allowed to access it. And to do that, we need to define some custom authentication schemes in our project. We will make use of this custom authentication schemes to tell this home controller class that home controller class, you should not allow anybody in this particular controller, but only allow the admin to access it. So let's How do we implement this authentication scheme? So here in the authorize attribute, we need to specify that we are going to make use of authentication scheme, and we have to provide the name of the authentication scheme that we want to use. So we want to use an authentication scheme called as admin. Now this authentication scheme admin is not yet created. So we need to create this authentication scheme and implement it in our project. So to create the authentication scheme, we will create another service in our project, and we will use that project to store all the authentication schemes that we are going to use in this CMS underscore score underscore ng project. So let's go back to the project, right click on it, and let's add a new project. So here I will select the web console, go to library, select the class library, make sure that the class library is a .NET Core class library, click next. Here I will call this service as filter service, and here inside this service I will have all the filters that I will use at the action or controller levels. So here I'm going to make sure that when I save this particular or create this particular project, I place this project inside my main project folder where all these services or the class libraries are located. Do not place it inside the folder which contains your csproj file. So do not place it here. Make sure you place it in the folder which contains all other class libraries. So I will place it over here and then create this new project. So now we have the filters service created. I do not need this default class, so I'm going to delete it. Now inside the filter service, let's create the required action filters that we are going to use in our action method or at the class level. So inside the filter service that we just created, we need to add a class. Let's go ahead and add this new class. We are going to call this class as Admin Authentication Handler and click New. Make sure that you name the class the way I have named it. Now, Admin Authentication Handler needs to be part of the authentication scheme that we are going to use in the admin panel or in the controller that we need to protect and only allow the admin to access. So to make this class a authentication scheme, I need to make sure that this class is inherited from the authentication handler. So let's add the missing references for authentication handler. Now I do not have any missing references. That's because I have not yet installed the required packages in this filter service project. So let's go ahead and install the required packages so we can create our custom authentication handler. So first package that we are going to add, it's going to be the Microsoft.AspNetCore.Authentication. So let's search for AspNetCore.Authentication, and here we have Microsoft.AspNetCore.Authentication. We will add this class and we will use the latest stable version and we will add the package. Now we need to add few more packages, so let's go ahead and add them. So we'll add all the required packages that we need, but we might not use them in this video tutorial, but in the upcoming video tutorials we would be making use of them. So let's accept the license agreement and then add those packages. So the package is successfully added. Few more packages that we need to add, so let's quickly go to NUGET packages and search for Microsoft.AspNetCore.Mvc.Abstractions. So Microsoft.AspNetCore.Mvc. So Microsoft AspNetCore.Mvc.Abstractions. I'm going to add the latest stable version, add it. So the package is added. We also need to validate tokens. So we need to add a new package as well. This package is called as IdentityModel.Tokens. So let's search for it. IdentityModel.Tokens. So we have Microsoft Identity Models.Token. So let's search for the correct package. So here is the package, Microsoft.IdentityModel.Tokens. We need this package to manage the tokens in our application. So we need to validate the token. So we will need this. So we will add the latest stable version, which is 6.7.1. So whenever you're watching this video tutorial, make sure you add the whatever available latest version you find. So I'm going to add this package. And we need one more package since we are going to create these tokens, and these tokens are JWT tokens, which are JSON web tokens. So we need to add a package so that we can make use of the required classes to validate our JWT tokens. So that package is called as System.IdentityModels.Tokens.Jwt. So I will search for it, System.IdentityModel.Tokens.Jwt. The name of all these packages, I will provide it in the video description so you can download it. You can search it and download it in your filter service project. So I'm going to once again add the latest stable version, and I'm going to add this package. So if I go to the dependencies, go to NUGET, I should have all these packages. I have added 4 packages over here, and you should also have 4 packages in this filter service project. Now if I go to the authentication handler and see, I have a import statement available for me using Microsoft.AspNetCore.Authentication. I can use that, and now I have the reference added. But here, while extending or while inheriting this class from authentication handler, if we hover over the authentication handler class, you will see that it's asking us to provide a authentication option class to the base constructor. Even though we are not going to provide any options, we should still create this class and provide it to the base constructor. So let's go ahead and in the filter service, let's right click and add a new class. I'm going to call this class as Admin Authentication Options, and I'm going to hit new. So this class is created. Now in the Admin Authentication Options class, this class needs to be derived from this Authentication Scheme Options class. So I'm going to first add the reference to the import statement, which is using Microsoft.AspNetCore.Authentication. And here in this particular class, we don't need any constructor, so I'm going to get rid of it. Here we can provide all the custom options that we need for the authentication handler, but we are not using these options right now in this project or in this video tutorial series, so we will leave this blank. If you need more information on authentication scheme options, you can read the documentation on Microsoft's official website, and I will provide the link in the video description on how to use the options in your authentication handlers. Now the actual logic to allow the admin in the home controller will be done in this particular class, which is the admin authentication handler. And as I mentioned, we have to provide the option to the base constructor. So let's provide the class that we just created, which is admin authentication schemes over here. So this will now get rid of the error here. Now we need to also make sure we implement the required methods once we have derived the admin authentication handler class from the authentication handler. So if we hover over it and implement the abstract class, you will see that you have a new method called as handle authenticate async that has been implemented. And here inside this class, we are going to write or code the logic for validating the request for that comes in to the home controller. But we also need to provide another class, uh, another method in this admin authentication handler class, which is if the authentication fails, what should the how should the request be handled. So someone tries to access the home controller who's not an admin, then that particular user should be redirected to the login page or to the access denied page, or should be locked, or whatever, his IP should be blocked. So that needs to be handled. So to handle the request, if the user is not authenticated or not authorized, we need to add another method called as handle challenge async. So I have added the comments for you to understand why we need this class. So this class is this method is needed because we need to handle if authentication fails. So we need to handle the request. In that scenario, we are going to make use of this method and we'll implement the logic as we proceed. But for now, we are just returning the completed task property. So now what we are going to work on is the logic for this handle authenticate async method. In the constructor, we need to instantiate certain objects using dependency injection. So the objects that we need, first of all, we need the user manager object, and we need the iService provider, which is part of System iService provider, and we need our identity default options. Now go to your project, right click on your project and go to add and reference your model service project, because the user manager, the application user, and the identity default options, these are part of model service project. So I have referenced the project here. Click OK, and then you can add the using statement, which is Microsoft.AspNetCore.Identity for the user manager, and the model service for application user and for identity default options. All this code will be provided in the DevOps repo. So in case you have missed something, you can refer to the code that's available in our repo. Now we also need to create two additional classes, one that will hold all the app settings value, or the map over all the values from our app settings file. Uh, we will create a class for that, and we also need a class for data protection keys that we are going to use to encrypt or decrypt the tokens. So we will create these model classes inside our model service. So let's right click and add a new class. Call this class as app settings. We will add another class. Let's call this class as data protection keys. Go back to the admin authentication handler and add the objects over here. I've created an object of type data protection keys and app settings, and we need few more objects that we are going to uh, create or hard code them over here. So here we would need a constant objects whose value will never change. So the value remains the same. We cannot change the values once declared. So we need a access token. We need a user ID object, which is going to be a string, a username, and the user roles. For this particular uh, admin authentication handler, the only role that is going to be authenticated to view the home control or any other protected view in the admin area would be of a type role called as administrator. If we go to the data service of our application that we created here in the application DB context class, we have already created this role called as administrator. So if you have not watched the data service tutorial, how we created the database using entity framework code go ahead and watch it in this video tutorial series, because there we have explained how we created the administrator role while creating the database. So now we have the required objects. Now let's instantiate all these objects that we created in the constructor of this admin authenticate handler class. So let's go ahead and do that. So first thing that we need to instantiate or pass in the constructor are the default values for iOption monitor, logger factory, your logger, your URL encoder, and the iSystem clock. And the way we will do it, we'll pass these values to the base constructor of our authentication handler is by providing them in the constructor. So let's add the missing reference to iOptions monitor using Microsoft extension options. iLogger factory, let's add the reference to Microsoft extension logging, and then the URL encoder we need using system.text.encoding web, and iSystem clock is already added because it's part of system, the authentication, which is already referenced over here. So now these are the default options that are going to be passed to the base constructor. They will be automatically instantiated and added to the constructor and passed to the base constructor. Now what we need to instantiate here is these options that we created using dependency injection, so that we can make use of these objects inside this handle authenticate async method. Before we do that, let's add the options that we need to pass to the base constructor, which I forgot to do. So let's add the base constructor, what options we need to pass to the base constructor, and then add the other options. Okay, so I have added the required objects that I need to be passed to the constructor. Now, the way dependency injection works is when this class is instantiated, it will find these objects in the memory of your application. If they are instantiated, it will find it and it will pass it to the constructor. So it will find it in the pipeline or the middleware of your application. Now we are assigning the values of these required objects that we got from dependency injection to the objects or read-only objects that we created over here. So I'm not going to get into detail of dependency injection, how it works, because that's not within the scope of this video tutorial series. If you want to know more about dependency injection, I will provide a link in the video tutorial where you can read about it and understand it better. But this is how we will pass the dependency objects that we need to the constructor and the other objects to the base constructor. Now here inside the handle authenticate async method, let's start writing or coding the logic. So let's get rid of this implementation. Before we just do that, let's go ahead and implement these app settings and data protection classes with the required properties. So we don't need the constructor over here in the app settings. So the required properties that we need is the website. Site will basically hold the website name, the audience, and I will explain all these values in detail. But for now, just add these properties. These are the required properties that we need. And we also need to add the properties to our data protection key. So we don't need the constructor over here. So here I'm going to create a property called as application user key. We will be adding more properties in this particular class as we proceed, but for now we're just going to make use of the application user key property. We will use this property to hold the key value for the decryption of any user related data. So we are going to encrypt user related data in this application using a key. Now that key will be stored in an object called as application user key in the app settings, and we will map over that value to this particular property. I know it will sound a bit confusing at this point, but as we proceed, you will understand. I will explain in step by step how these properties are mapped and used. So for now, just create these two classes, app settings and data protection keys, add the required properties as I mentioned. Now we will go back to the authentication handler and now we will write the logic over here. So now first let's get rid of these implementation default throw no implementation method and just write our logic over here. So I'm going to get rid of this comment and I'm going to start writing the logic. Now before implementing the logic, let's once again look at our process for the authentication. So if we have a protected view, so in our case this is the home controller. The user is trying to access this home controller, and the user, if it's trying to access the home controller, needs to the request needs to contain a authorization token and a refresh token. If the request contains a token, then we will forward the request to the appropriate controller. In our case, it will be the home controller. The home controller will then forward the request to the auth service. Now, the first thing, let's implement the first step over here where we want to check if the request that is coming in contains a token. And to do that, all we need to do is we need to add a if condition over here. We need to check if the HTTP request that is coming in contains an access token in the cookie. So for that, we will use the request object of the ASP.NET Core HTTP request and then call the cookies.contains_key method and check if it contains a cookie called as access token. Now access token basically means a string name or access underscore token. So we go to the finished project. If I log in and pay attention to the application tab in the developer console, and we will look at the cookies, and if I log in, okay, my password, and here once I logged in, I have a cookie with a name called as access underscore token. So that's what we are going to search for in the request. We are going to search for a cookie called as access token, a cookie called as user underscore ID, and both these are available in the cookies, and we will try to access it via the HTTP request that comes in. So make sure that the name matches the name that we are using in the authentication handler. So here we are checking if the request contains the access token cookie and it contains the user ID cookie. If it does not contain these cookies, then straight away we are going to invalidate the request saying that the authentication result was a no result. So now what we need to do, here we are getting this error because this method is not async and we are trying to await for the response. So let's make this method async and that will remove this error. Now the first condition is to check if there is any cookie. So if there is no cookie, then we return a no result. Now, which means if you want to proceed further, that means we have found a cookie in the HTTP request, and the next step will be to get the values from this cookie. But before we get the values from the cookies, we would add a log error in the log file because we can then know that somebody was trying to access the admin panel unauthorized access. So we will log this error. Now let's go to the filter service and add the reference to our logging service that we have created. So reference the logging service. Now okay, and now we should have reference to using serilog. So log.error, and here we have using serilog. So now we can log an error saying that no access token was found, or you can customize this message on or whatever you like, so it doesn't have to be what I have added over here. So the next step then would be to parse the token from the header, and if the parsing fails, then we will return a no result. So the user has a token. Let's try to get the token from the header, and the way we will do it using the authentication header value class, and then it's available under using system.net.http headers. Using this authentication header value class dot the try parse method, we will try to parse the access token that we received in the request and if the parsing fails, then we will return a no result, and if the parsing is a success, that means we were able to get a value out of this access token, then we will proceed further. So to the next step. Now the next step would be to parse the user ID, so let's do that as well. So here I'm going to add the uh, parsing for the user ID from the header request that we are receiving, and if the parsing fails, then we will return a no result. So far we have done the required steps that are needed to validate the incoming request for cookies, for access token, and for user ID. Now we have the cookies, we have parsed them successfully, we have got these values. Now the step would be to go ahead and decrypt this access tokens or decrypt these cookies and get the values from those cookies and that token, from the token and from the user ID. Because if we look at the finished project and if we look at the value of this access token, it is encrypted. If you look at the value of the user ID, it's encrypted. So this is not a user ID, this is an encrypted value. We need to decrypt this and get the actual user ID value and get the actual token value. So our next step in authentication handler will be to decrypt this values and get the actual values out of these objects. So here I'm going to add a try catch block, and I'm going to log an error in case the authentication fails. That means that we were not able to decrypt the cookie, so the authentication will be fail, and I will return a result saying that the authentication has failed. So here I am going to, in the catch block, log the error. I will log the stack trace, the actual error, and the inner exception and source using string interpolation, and then finally I will return a authentication result fail, you are not authorized, as the message back to the request. So now the error has been handled. So now what we need to do is write the logic to decrypt and get the values from the token. So that we will do in the next video tutorial, because I don't want to make this video lengthy, so I have split the video tutorial in different parts. So in this part 1, what we have learned is creating a custom authentication handler, creating a filter service for that custom authentication handler, how to use the authorize attribute over here, reference the required authorization configurations in the uh, startup class, and all this code that we have used will be available in the video description in the DevOps repo. You can go ahead and get the code if you need it. And if you have any questions, use the comment section. And don't forget to like and subscribe my channel, Tech Howdy.